Today's event is The World in 2023, from pandemic to the war of Ukraine, how to adapt to living in a constant crisis. At the end, you will have the chance and the time for your questions. We have an amazing panel with us today. I would like to introduce our chairman, Vicky Pryce, who is an economist and business consultant. She is Chief Economic Advisor and a board member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Her books are very, very, very famous. The last one is The Women vs. Capitalism, and before this, she was partner at the accounting and consulting firm KPMG, after senior economic position in banking and the soil sector. She also holds a number of academic posts and is a fellow and council member of the UK Academy for Social Sciences. Vicky, do you want to participate the other one, or will you come here for the others, for the other participants?
Right, I will start from here, if that's
okay.
all right.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the
Thank you very much, and I will let you know about our next events at the end. Enjoy and enjoy this panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for this introduction. And I'm sorry we're starting a bit late. It was explained that there was a bit of misunderstanding whether it was starting at 6 or it was starting at 7. So we've got a compromise and we're starting at 6:30. But it is great to see so many of you here in any case. And I have to say that in terms of how this all started, I got a call from Natasha Vezzuri in the usual way saying, Vicky, would you do this talk for us? And could you make sure you bring a really good panel along with you? Which is, of course, exactly what's happened. And I'm delighted to have with us today, first of all, starting at the other end, Ian Harwood, who is a city economist, and with whom I have just written another book, not just the one that was just mentioned. It has the rather embarrassing title, How to Be a Successful Economist. Now, of course, it assumes that we are successful economists, that's why we can write it. So I wasn't keen on the title, but I was overruled by my authors, but anyway, we have a little show there. And of course, we forgot to bring any copies, but there you go. That's what happens. And also Nikos Konstandaras, who came all the way from Greece for this, just arrived on a day where there is a strike. He was helped hugely by the committee here, the organizers, to come over from the airport. He was terribly worried that he was going to arrive late, so the fact we're starting a bit late is a very good thing for him, but thank you very much, Nico. Nico is a distinguished journalist. He has been for many years, about 13 years, he was managing editor of Kathimerini in Greek, the Greek edition, and also for 19 years, the managing editor of the English edition of Kathimerini. And he's still now contributing editor and writes columns, which I read avidly whenever I can get my hands on Kathimerini. We're also together on a committee that brings the British and Greek diplomats, business people all together, which is the Greek-British Symposium, which we run 1 year in Greece and 1 year in England, and the last one we had was in Nafplion, and a number of the people who were there in Nafplion are here also today, which is fantastic. We had it in October. So this is the panel. The way we're going to do it is slightly irregular in the sense that not only am I chairing, but I'm also going to speak a little bit. So what we'll do is we will start with Ian, who's going to show some slides. Then I will go and show a few more slides. And then Nico may or may not, he's not quite sure, stand up and go over there and speak without slides, or he's going to do it over here. It all depends on how exhausted you are after your traveling, and particularly traveling in a strike-torn England to get over to here. You've heard Great. So the title, of course, of today is The World in 2023, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine. And of course, there's been one crisis after another And the question is, how do we adapt to this? And do we actually have the means to survive? And of course, this may not be the last crisis by any stretch of the imagination. So, Ian, over to you, and hopefully we'll be wiser by the end of your 20 minutes.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the world as a whole, but then I'm going to focus very much upon China and the United States. And Vicky is then going to come in and talk about what's going on in Europe, both the EU and the UK. I hope that division of labour will work well. I'm very confident it's likely to. But before I start, I would just like to flag up the book which Vicky mentioned, How to Be a Successful Economist. There are 4 authors. As an Englishman, I do tend to be self-deprecating, so actually I do find the title slightly embarrassing. But obviously, if you're an American, you think you should be shouting from the rooftops about your achievements. So anyway, I would recommend the book, but in particular, to people, you may have children or particularly grandchildren who might be studying economics or thinking of studying economics. It's a very useful guide to that, and we think it fills a unique place in the market which was absent before. So do have a look if you can. It's really a guide to people that want to be economists, and hopefully it will help many people on their way and inspire them. With that, I'm just going to talk about some of the key macro issues in the world, but first I thought I'd start with a couple of pertinent quotations. Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister of this country from 1957 to 63, was once asked what the most troubling problem of his Prime Ministership was, and he replied, "Events, my dear boy, events." Now, of course, he meant unexpected developments by this. Arnold Toynbee, a noted historian who wrote many years ago, said history is one damn thing after another. And Alan Bennett, in his wonderful play The History Boys, actually put this in a slightly cruder way, but I'll leave you to look that up if you don't actually know it. But the point is, things do come along unexpectedly, and over the last 15 years or so, there have been a whole sequence of events which have constituted adverse shocks to the global economy. And I list them here. The global financial crisis, which now is over 15 years ago, but still seems very recent indeed, massive shock to expectations. Before the crisis, the global economy was going very strongly, fueled by globalization and China, and very rapid growth in America and Europe, and it was a non-inflationary boom. But of course, whereas on the surface, many people thought everything was okay, there were some very serious fissures developing, and that's really what happened with the global financial crisis, when banks threatened to go under and the global economy threatened to implode. And there was a time in the winter of 2008-2009 when it did look as if we were looking at a rerun of the early 1930s, when world production and trade were contracting very rapidly. Happily, governments and policymakers generally had learnt the lessons of the 1930s and responded appropriately. They didn't make the same mistakes they made then, but it was a damn close-run thing. Then, of course, we had the euro area sovereign debt crisis from 2011 to 13, until Draghi waved his magic wand and made everything hold together again. And then, of course, we had trade tensions emerge, both with the election of Trump as the US president in 2016 and with Brexit in the UK, and somewhat fraught relations, to put it mildly, between the UK and the EU following that. Then, of course, came the global pandemic, which nobody was expecting, and that I viewed as the greatest challenge to economists I'd ever seen. I've been working in markets now for 45 years, and to me, this was an extraordinary development, and we really had to go back to first principles to figure out exactly what was going on. Then, of course, we had Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and finally, of course, we've had inflation, which has been resurgent on a scale not seen since the 1970s, and a subject of massive concern, not just in the UK, but also in the United States, and of course throughout Europe. Now, unsurprisingly, uncertainty has risen. Nobody quite knows what's going to happen. And if you just look at this graph, it's the IMF has put together a world uncertainty index. It's based upon a word count, basically, the number of times uncertainty is mentioned. But as you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, in the 1990s, when, of course, globalization was in full swing and everything seemed hunky-dory in the wake of the implosion of the USSR and the supposed end of history, it was very, very low. Then it picked up and it rose to record levels with the onset of the pandemic, but it still is very high, largely, I think, because of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the geopolitical anxieties which that has actually generated. Just to show you another chart, economic policy uncertainty, what a policymaker is going to do, that tells exactly the same story in the sense that basically people are now very confused and we do live in very unprecedented times. Just an illustration of the backdrop against which we're all labouring at the moment. Now, last year, of course, was a time of some very adverse macro developments. We had the realisation that the surge of inflation we saw worldwide in 2021 wasn't transitory, as many people initially thought, including our key central bankers, and wasn't about to subside of its own accord. As a result, central bankers began to accept that their cheap money policy settings, which were adopted in the wake of the global financial crisis and then the global pandemic, had to be abandoned, that is zero interest rates and quantitative easing, in common parlance, printing money. Then, of course, you had Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, which greatly heightened geopolitical uncertainty and boosted world commodity prices, particularly the prices of energy. And you had China's unrelenting zero-COVID policy, which produced the weakest GDP growth in China for many years indeed. And, of course, throughout the year, people got progressively less optimistic or more pessimistic about the outlook for global growth. A year ago, people were still talking about the roaring 20s in America and Europe, how economies would boom on the back of a spending surge as the pandemic receded. Now, of course, we're talking about the threat of recession. It's been a massive turnaround in expectations. And that really is my starting point for what I want to talk about now. Key macro questions for this year. One is, how vigorous is the rebound in Chinese activity going to be now that the pandemic is beginning to recede in China, or at least they're taking it on the chin and hoping they will get through it? How quickly will inflation in the major developed economies fall back? I'm going to focus on the US in this, leaving the UK and Euro to Vicky. And then there's the key question of whether central banks are actually going to blink at signs of intensifying economic weakness, or instead remain determined to put the inflation genie back in the bottle. If you look at the behaviour of financial markets, which you may or may not follow, it's quite clear that certainly in America, the markets are betting that the Fed is actually going to relent and that it's going to start cutting interest rates in the second half of the year. The Fed isn't saying this. The Fed's actually saying it's going to raise rates further and it's going to keep them high. And I take the Fed very seriously, and I actually think the markets are being misplaced in their judgment at this juncture. But be that as it may, that at the moment is the sentiment in the markets. And then I'm going to ask whether there's really going to be a US soft landing. Again, the markets in America at the moment are taking the view that the economy will be landed without a serious recession, without unemployment going up significantly. I think that is a triumph of hope over experience. There's only been one soft landing in American post-war history. That was in 94-95, and that was very special indeed. I think actually a recession is highly likely in the United States. But again, you will find contrary opinions in the media and the markets generally. On China, it's early days yet. China abandoned its zero-COVID policy late last year. Since then, the pandemic has rushed throughout China, as you'd expect, but there are signs that economic activity is beginning to revive. There are two key business surveys which give you a fairly timely indication of how China is doing, and they've both been published this week. The official PMI, put together by the State Statistical Agency, showed a very strong bounce back indeed, led by service activity. And the Kaixing business survey, its rival, if you like, which concentrates very much upon the private sector and the coastal regions, the Chinese new economy, if you like, that showed a strong rebound too. As you can see from this chart, the bottom line is an activity index. The top line is expectations for 6 months hence. They've both taken a very marked turn for the better over the course of the last month. Additional confirmation comes from the Hong Kong PMI survey, which was published this morning, which shows that new business from China revived strongly in January to actually put it in an expansionary phase. It hasn't been expansionary now for over 1.5 years. So again, that's a significant watershed. The key issue, of course, is whether consumers come out of their shells. In America and in Europe, consumers built up their savings during the pandemic and they have subsequently run them down. And that's really maintained consumer spending while real incomes have been compressed or even reduced by high energy and food prices and very high inflation. Will China be the same? I simply don't know. Chinese savings are incredibly high, but the Chinese, of course, do have a propensity to be big savers. Also, of course, the Chinese economy does have some very specific problems, notably the real estate sector, which accounts overall for at least 25% of overall GDP. So I think the jury has to be out on this at the moment. The IMF, though, has actually nailed its numbers to the wall. In its World Economic Outlook, the quarterly update it published last week, it actually upped its Chinese economic forecast for GDP this year from 4.4, if I recall correctly, to 5.6%, and also stressed the upside benefit that this would have for the rest of the world. In fact, it suggested that each 1% increase in Chinese GDP would push world GDP up by 0.3%. That's quite a considerable number. So a lot hangs on China, but as I say, I think it's early days yet, and nobody, frankly, including the Chinese government, actually knows how Chinese consumers or businesses are going to respond. It is a wholly unprecedented situation. Just a picture here to show how severe the current inflation challenge is. We often read in the newspapers it's the worst inflation in all the major economies, with the exception of Japan, since the early 80s and the 1970s. And this shows that it's not quite as bad as it was then, but nonetheless it is very severe. And certainly the period of price stability, which became established in the 1990s and persisted right through up until the middle of the pandemic, basically that's come to an end. So the key issue now is whether US and European central bankers can actually get inflation back down again to their 2% target. Now, I'm a great fan of economic and financial history, and I'm a great fan of lessons learned. And one of the lessons of the past century has been that of the Great Depression. And indeed, I've spent my whole career with people worrying that we could see a repeat of the 1930s. As I said earlier, the global financial crisis did actually pose such a challenge, and for a few brief weeks, it did look as if we could be plunging into a similar abyss. In the event, of course, the lessons were learned, and if you just run your eyes very quickly over those lessons, you'll see that's exactly what policymakers did. In particular, despite Lehman, they didn't let banking systems overall collapse, and also they adopted other very sensible measures. Now, another episode which we can learn lessons from, of course, is the 1970s, when we did have extraordinarily high inflation, which at the time was an incredible surprise, because in the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s, the major economies had got used to a very low level of inflation. And these are really the basic lessons which you derive from the 1970s. First of all, you shouldn't allow economies to overheat as you pursue full employment. Now, to some degree, that's exactly what governments did unintentionally with the pandemic. They afforded a great deal of fiscal support to their households and to their corporates. And when the pandemic eased, of course, people started spending again. And at the same time, supply was constricted. There were labour shortages, there were supply shortages domestically and particularly global. And that actually was the key factor behind the surge in inflation in all the major economies. Demand went up strongly, supply couldn't meet it, and as always, prices tend to rise in those circumstances. Now, the next 3 points basically pose the challenge for central bankers at the moment. How to stop external commodity price shocks, i.e. high energy and high food prices, leading into inflation in general, or core inflation. Ensure that inflationary expectations stay anchored at a low level, and endeavour to avoid any wage price spiral, which was certainly a feature of the 1970s. Now, as for point 1, feeding into core inflation, I'm not sure they've been terribly successful yet, because core inflation has actually risen quite substantially in all the major economies, and companies have quite obviously been raising prices like crazy. something they couldn't do prior to the pandemic. As for the inflation expectations, central banks have been much more successful. And if you look at what bond markets are saying, or you look at what household surveys are saying, you'll see that actually inflation expectations, after a brief upward spike, are now really quite subdued. Not as low as they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago, but not far away either. So I think central bankers are doing a good job at the moment in holding those inflation expectations down. People believe that they're actually going to get inflation down again to 2% or something thereabouts. And I think they're right to believe that. And finally, of course, there's the risk of a wage price spiral, which you could argue we're facing at the moment in the UK with the widespread strikes that we've seen today. What we had in the 1970s was inflation going up, wage settlements chasing them upwards, which in turn kept inflation high. At the moment, though, I think it's quite likely that despite very tight labour markets that we're not actually going to see this. I'm not going to go into any detailed discussion, although you may want to raise it in questions afterwards. But certainly in the United States, for example, although the unemployment rate we learnt today had actually fallen to 3.4%, its lowest level since 1969, there is evidence that wage inflation, although very high, is actually beginning to decelerate. So perhaps, after all, there's not going to be a wage price spiral as we had in the 1970s. And the final factor, I think, is you have to accept that there may have to be the creation of economic slack, i.e. higher unemployment, to actually get inflation down. Now, clearly, no central bank is going to trumpet that from the rooftops because it's very politically unpopular, but I think they're thinking that if unemployment has to rise, so be it, that if that is the necessary cost of getting inflation back down again. Now, the recent US inflation experience, so I'll just try and get rid of this thing on the screen. Not quite sure how that's got there.
It's about bad weather in Greece, I think.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it up for fear of disrupting everything. But the recent US inflation experience is that inflation has risen very high to not to 10% as it did in the 1970s, but nonetheless very, very high. But it has now begun to come down again. And that, of course, has made people very relieved that at least inflation is heading in the right direction. Now, the Fed in the 1970s, actually, not only was it caught napping by the surge of inflation, first in the early 70s, then in the mid-70s, and also in the late 70s, but also they eased policy very dramatically in the wake of the 1974-75 recession. Unemployment had gone through the roof, there was much discontent, and they decided to start cutting rates. And for a while, it looked as if everything was hunky-dory. But as you can see from that chart, with that blue line, core inflation began to rise again, and the Fed then had to play follow your leader and get interest rates up to an historically unprecedented level. This happened under Chairman Volcker, who took over at the Fed in 1979, who basically decided to come down very hard on inflation, even if it meant the economy going to severe recession and seeing high unemployment. Now, I think that people have insufficient memory of what the Fed did then and insufficient realisation that the Fed at the moment realises what went wrong there and actually won't ease back that quickly this time round. I do think the Fed is very serious about getting inflation down, and that of course means, as I said earlier, that the markets might be somewhat wrong in their current judgment that the Fed is actually going to blink in the second half of this year. Now, recessions in the US, if they occur, always result in disinflation. So if there is a recession in the United States, it's likely to bring inflation coming down quite quickly. But at the moment, of course, the US economy is incredibly resilient. You won't have seen this because you're not a data junkie like I am, but if you look at your newspaper tomorrow at the financial pages, you'll see that in the US this afternoon, an extremely robust employment report was released, which showed a net gain of over 500,000 jobs, which is incredibly high for the United States. In the pre-COVID era, the average monthly gain was under 200,000. You'll also see, as I said earlier, that the unemployment rate has fallen down to 3.4%, and you'll also see that the service sector, according to one long-established survey, is still actually very robust, which suggests that the US is still far from recession. It has slowed down over the last few months, but nonetheless, it's yet to actually go off the precipice. Now, my final point is simply about a US soft landing. Lots of people seem to think, and an ex-Fed governor actually published a book last year arguing this, that a soft landing was a very realistic prospect this year. I take a rather contrary view. Soft landings are very rare. In fact, the only serious soft landing was that of 94-95. And rather worryingly, in the run-up to the global financial crisis in 2007, an awful lot of people were taking that 94-95 experience as a template and thinking that nothing bad was going to happen then. In the event, of course, they were absolutely wrong. It was the worst US recession since the early 1930s. I don't think this time we are going to get an absolutely awful recession. The US economy doesn't have the excesses it had then. The housing market is certainly not so high and certainly not so leveraged. And people basically haven't been spending dramatically beyond their means. But nonetheless, a recession, I think, is very, very likely as the Fed seeks to make sure that inflation is actually curbed. Now, this is a very contentious issue. We're not going to know for quite a while exactly what is going to happen. But I think that if I'm right, and there is actually a recession, however modest it may actually be, then people are going to be very disappointed in the US. The consolation, though, as I say, is if there is a recession, it's not going to be that large, it's not going to be that long, it should be relatively brief, and also that means it won't have nasty knock-on effects upon the rest of the world. But it doesn't look to me as if the US is going to get out of its current policy conundrum without something painful happening further down the track. And in that respect, just as I said, nobody actually knows what's going to happen in China, nobody really knows what the impact of the Fed tightening is actually going to be. During the course of less than 12 months, the Fed has raised its key policy rate from 0.25%, practically zero, to 4.75% earlier this week. That's 4.5 percentage points of monetary tightening at the short end of the curve in the space of less than 12 months. It hasn't happened before. Rates have never come up from zero before like that. And it could be that it could have a very nasty impact indeed. It could be that it doesn't. But nobody actually knows, including the Fed. So I think at the moment we're in an incredibly uncertain situation. But what I think we can be assured of is that US inflation is going to come down. It's going to get close to 2% over the next 2 years or so. And for that reason, there is some comfort to be derived what's happening at the moment. In the near term, though, I think we may well be in, despite what Wall Street's saying at the moment, in for a rather tricky period as the US economy begins to come under the cosh and begins to slow quite appreciably. Thank you very much. With that, I'll turn over to Vicky, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to ask questions in a moment when we both said our piece. Thank you.
The title of today is of course, how to survive all this crisis. And we just now learned that in order not to have any crisis, if something works, just leave it as is. And probably this is what we should have done. So thank you very much, Ian. And now I will go on to talk a little bit about Europe and the UK. Taking on some of the themes, and then Nikos is going to talk a little bit about Greece. So bear with me then if I spend a little bit of time just going through this at present. So I think it's worth just bearing in mind that we are in a crisis right now. We've got the war in Ukraine, of course, and everything that's happened with energy prices over the last couple of years. Of course, it's 2022, it's a year ago when the invasion was there, but of course, when the invasion happened, but we had energy prices going up anyways. We recovered from COVID because, of course, demand increased very significantly and the world couldn't quite respond. And we moved from this crazy situation where we had a period of negative oil prices, when oil prices were minus $37 a barrel in the summer of 2020. Which is an extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. And then, of course, things recovered for the oil companies, and now, of course, they're making huge profits. But one of the interesting things is that we had completely forgotten the fact that after a period of being quite efficient in terms of our energy demand, we had become quite inefficient, mainly because prices were so low. And a lot of gas was coming very cheaply from Russia into Europe. And our energy demand per unit of output actually went up, which wasn't supposed to be the case at all, but this is what had happened. Of course, everyone was worried about climate change increasingly and so on, but in reality, imports of gas and oil had increased significantly in Europe, and of course dependence on Russia had increased as well. So this is really why we were so vulnerable with the war in Ukraine, and everything has happened since. But of course, we had already had a big crisis, which was the pandemic, and we were just coming out of it. Now, you've got to adjust very, very quickly as a policymaker to all this. And of course, loads of countries did. We had this huge expansion of liquidity in the economy. We had a lot of fiscal loosening that took place, zero interest rates practically in by the central banks across the world. And that, of course, fueled this demand again when restrictions were lifted, and of course kept the economies going, because otherwise it would have been a complete and utter disaster. But then, of course, came this crisis, this extra crisis, just as we were thinking that things were going to be fine, but of course they were not, and a lot of adjustment had to be made. So that was a crisis like no other in some ways, because there was also war, there was geopolitical tensions, Russia was no longer prepared to supply gas as it did before, prices were shooting up, I mean, it's affected all our expenses at home. Businesses found their input costs going up significantly, so it was a little bit of a disaster, with the result, of course, that 2022 was not a particularly good year for growth. It wasn't sort of disastrous, but you can still see the recovery from COVID in some of those figures, which was the brown one. But 2023 looks worse. Even though prices have started coming down in various areas, there is still serious concern about what's going to happen next. And if you look further down in 2024, since I'm supposed to talk about Europe and the UK, you've got Germany, of course, in trouble. They did have a quarterly decline in GDP in the 2022 last quarter. And the worrying thing about the UK in particular, when you look at 2024, and this is why there was a serious concern about some of the recent pronouncements by those international institutions, is that UK and Russia are the worst economies in 2024. Not good news. Not nice to be associated with Russia, which of course is having all these problems and various sanctions imposed on it, but of course it still managed to do sort of reasonably well. So quite a lot of pessimism ahead. So in some countries, we just see that they're above pre-pandemic levels, but in many others, including the UK, we're not. So we're still below pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at the latest forecast by the Bank of England, they're expecting that even by 2026, we're still going to be below pre-pandemic levels in the UK. So, policymakers, what do? In an environment like this? Do they borrow more and stimulate the economy more? No. What are they doing here? They're trying to borrow less and increasing taxes to ensure that this is the case, and trying not to give those wage increases to workers, which they fear is going to be negative for the fiscal side. And yet, there are some positives. And how do policymakers adjust? We just heard everything about interest rates. Now, was it right to raise interest rates the way we've seen? Quite significant, very sharp increases of the type we haven't seen, well, ever really, that type, well, a little bit in the UK during the fiasco of having joined the European exchange rate mechanism, ERM, and then having to leave it when interest rates were going up by 2 or 3 points an hour in that fateful day of September when we finally were forced to leave the ERM. And it was one of the reasons why, of course, we never joined the euro, I suppose. But what you see is that the expectations are that inflation is going to drop. And you ask policymakers, why? What have you learned then from everything that's happened? What is the point of raising interest rates if domestically it doesn't make any difference? What really matters is what happens internationally in terms of energy prices and other things. But you see the drop that is expected to take place. Now, of course, we could have an escalation of the war. In Ukraine, we hear Russia intending perhaps to do all sorts of things, maybe this month. And that's the real issue. But nevertheless, in the vast majority of cases, we expect to get back to something like target, which is sort of 2%. Look at the European inflation rate. I mean, of course, Greece is affected just like everybody else. It's been coming down now for a number of months. And arithmetically, you could have told this to the central banks. I mean, I was one of those people who was constantly defending the central banks. Why have they not raised interest rates early enough? Why have they let this inflation happen? It had nothing to do with what they were doing. It had all to do with energy prices because of the war. And of course, prices had increased before. But even if prices after that, without the war, had stabilized, which was what people were anticipating, we could easily, very quickly have got to zero inflation. Because if you look year on year, if prices stay the same, then that's zero. And somehow or other, it just wouldn't get into people's heads that this is what would happen. This is exactly what's going on right now. This is, of course, what's happening in terms of the euro inflation. You still have, of course, energy being a significant part of it, but it's coming down. So we're talking about, just 8.5% inflation instead of whatever the double digit that we had earlier. Of course, it's now beginning to come into other bits of the economy, like the services sector. But overall, even though it looks, quite significant to you, but you see what's happening with energy, it is by far still, although stabilizing, the biggest part of what adds to your inflation. But this is now changing. That was the January figures I just showed you before. But this is what's going on. European gas prices have fallen now to levels that they were before the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine. So very, very substantial decline has taken place. Oil prices, as I say here, they're only a few dollars above levels of where they were in early 2022. Very substantial if you like, stabilization of this, which is very good news. Food prices, yes, of course, here at the shops, we're paying an awful lot still because there are so many of these input costs that happened earlier. And also there were shortages of fertilizers because nothing was coming out of the Ukraine and their main supplier of fertilizers. There were shortages of grain because the ports were shut, if you remember. And now there is an agreement. Russia has signed it. For the moment, it's all coming out of Ukraine where it was all stuck before. Food prices, international food prices, have been coming down now for 9 consecutive months. So that should eventually filter through to overall costs. So yes, I showed you some pessimistic forecasts for the UK and Russia before, but the latest forecasts by the International Monetary Fund are slightly better than they were before. And if you can see here, this is the January ones are the solid lines. The previous ones are in October, where the dotted lines. What you see is overall there is a bit of an improvement in their forecast. Not huge by any means for the world as a whole. For the advanced economies, not so much. And unfortunately for the UK, they have a worse forecast than before because of all the reasons I mentioned before. High interest rates, taxes going up, cost of living issues, making it impossible for anyone to get real increases in their living standards. But in Europe, of course, you've got other problems. Here you have, think about policymakers. This is really, what have we learned from the crisis? I mean, that's basically what the topic is today, and how can we do things better in the future? Well, there you are, assuming you work for the European Central Bank, and you have one interest rate. That interest rate, the interest rates in the European, they still had one of their interest rates. They don't have one, I correct myself. They have a series of interest rates, but you have one series of interest rates for the entire Eurozone, where you have all these countries, which of course are very different. Just look at the last column there, which shows you what the inflation rates are in Germany, in Europe. The German one, we're still not quite sure. We think it's come down to 8.5%. Not quite sure yet because it's been revised and delayed, apparently. But look at the others and you see the differences that exist. Here you are, a European Central Bank with inflation, which can vary from 6.8% in one country. I mean, France, of course, still quite low, at 7%, to nearly 20% in the Baltic states, and have a single interest rate policy, which is very, very difficult to do. That's why they're still hawkish. They say that we're going to increase interest rates even further. So you have this sort of strange environment, and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are actually worried that we're having this synchronized increase in interest rates, which perhaps, well, maybe they're there to slow down the economy and therefore reduce demand and therefore bring inflation down. But to target, of course, is 2%. Now just look at all these inflation figures on the right and think at 2%. But you can't do an awful lot except really possibly cause a recession by just raising rates very substantially. Most of the inflationary issues that I showed you before have to do with international factors like energy and food. Now, all this is happening We're very worried about the future. We're looking at some rather pessimistic forecasts, slightly better perhaps than before, but it's still quite pessimistic. But actually the economies are working. I mean, here in the UK, they're working very well in terms of employment. We have huge vacancies, and that's, there's a real shortage of labour, partly because of Brexit, but overall there's been an improvement. Even the statistics in Europe show 6.6% unemployment. We are at a better unemployment situation. In other words, unemployment is lower now than it was even pre-pandemic in all the countries, which is most extraordinary. That is, of course, because lots of people just disappeared from the workplace. They decided enough is enough, or they're sick, and they're not coming back. The UK here is trying to get everyone to come back to work so they can keep some wages down, perhaps, with talking about inducements, so you can keep your benefits even if you come back to work. Even if you're sick, you can keep your sickness benefits. Very odd. It hasn't happened yet, but those are the types of suggestions that are out there. But I said unemployment, the labour market is working, but there's no doubt the higher interest rates are curbing growth right now. And you see how they've been rising very, very significantly in the main parts of the advanced world. They are expected perhaps to have reached almost a peak now, but they're there. It costs an awful lot for everyone to borrow for a house right now. And also what we're seeing, this good unemployment situation, because of this interest rates I mentioned, it costs an awful lot more. People cannot go out and spend as much because interest rates are higher. The labour market, although still tight, seems to be cooling in the UK, and it probably will cool in Europe as well. It's interesting what Ian said about the US, that is still managing to do well. So what we're seeing in Europe then is this contraction which is taking place. This contraction in GDP that's happened. This is Germany, which of course was the one that had to deal with the loss of gas from Russia with a lot of policies to reduce energy consumption, and also of course to think of alternative ways of getting energy, but it has a lot of energy-intensive sectors, big manufacturing. They all depend on this, and yet you've got a problem. So here you are with the euro area manufacturing. Just to be able to read this slide, even though it looks like it's getting better, anything below 50 means there's a contraction. So it's falling. It may not be falling quite as fast as it did before. So that's the real worry. Interest rates, as I mentioned, are a real issue, but you don't have to look at that detail. But very substantial increases there perhaps can do more harm in the economy. They're constraining consumer spending very significantly. If you look, this one is trying to show you the real post-tax household income growth, which is moving to negative and continues to be negative through this year. And that, of course, means that there isn't going to be very much growth in the economy, hence why the forecasts for the UK are for minus 0.6% growth in the year as a whole. And as I said, even by 2026, we're not back to pre-pandemic levels. I mentioned the cost of borrowing, mortgage demand, house prices have been falling now for a number of months. This actually is happening everywhere, including, I'm afraid, in the US. Where those interest rates are really hurting. So that's basically where the picture is. And for the UK more directly, the forecasts, I'm afraid, are quite correct. This is the current output trend, which is going downwards. As you can see, this is the Purchasing Managers Index, which is declining. You see the figures for January showing that the services one is falling, and falling quite significantly. As you can see, the below 50 has been falling now for a number of months, which is a worry. And of course, you've also got manufacturing in decline, minus 50. So many months of negative manufacturing growth. This is not a great base for growth. So you think again, what have we learned, policymakers? Well, the economy is slowing down. There doesn't seem to be any intention of doing anything additional in terms of supporting it. A lot of the electricity price support schemes are going to be reduced in April, and in fact, we're going to be very, very low for businesses in particular, and that's a real problem. But this is the question we were all asked yesterday as we were commenting on the Bank of England's increase in interest rates. What have we learned from all this about inflation? What have we learned about whether increasing interest rates will do it? Well, the extraordinary thing is that if you look at the forecast for inflation by the Bank of England, whether we raise interest rates or not, they still have, in 2023, inflation coming down, as you can see the little star, and then 2024, coming down to be less than 4%. So by the end of 2023, we're less than 4%. And by 2024, and towards the end of it, and moving into 2025, but actually even before, we may well end up not just at the 2%, which is this line there, but almost at zero, because of what I explained to you earlier. So you just wonder, why do we need a monetary policy of this sort? What have we learned? And I'm afraid what we have learned is that there is pressure on the central banks. There is pressure to act, to be seen to be trying to influence inflationary expectations, whether it leads to complete misallocation of resources or not. And I'm afraid we're stuck in that environment. So finally then, I mean, that was, the European Central Bank has still got interest rates a bit below, but we got to bear in mind that there is still, from their side, which is different to the UK, and this is why one is more optimistic about Europe overall, and possibly about Greece, which is the fastest growing economy in the EU at present, or has been in 2022. There's a lot of money still being used now to make sure that the economy grows in the future. So you could argue that from the fiscal side, we've learned something. There is the Resilience and Recovery Fund, which is sort of part of the new generation EU. Now, we're talking about at least 2 trillion euros which are going to be spent on this. There is a massive asset purchase program, which, although it supposedly has come to an end, what we're seeing is that the European Central Bank still wants to support the highly indebted countries like Greece. Should there be an issue, then they can buy bonds again. So we don't stop quantitative easing, which we've had here for some time, whereas both in the UK and in the US, we're reversing it now to quantitative tightening, just to reinforce all the other issues that I was mentioning to you before. So there is still support, and perhaps it has been learned. Perhaps some lessons on the fiscal side in Europe have been learned, that perhaps everything that was done during the Eurozone crisis was not really having the impact that they had wished they did. And in many ways, you could argue that COVID and the crisis that we have had since with Russia has encouraged the development of institutions in Europe which allow you for greater resilience for the future. And in many ways, I often think how good it would have been if we had had the pandemic and the energy crisis we've had before the financial crisis that Ian spoke about. We may not have had the terrible happenings in Greece. I mean, during the pandemic and the energy crisis, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were encouraging everyone to just spend, spend, spend. As you know, the Stability and Growth Pact is suspended at present. State aid rules are being suspended, or at least the suggestion is that they should be suspended by the head of the European Commission. There is a rethink about how you run your policy. And I am actually quite hopeful that at least one part of the world has learned from the lessons of this crisis and has got its act together to ensure that we don't have a repeat of the disaster we have had before, and which, of course, has left Greece in such an impoverished state. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be here, and I'd like to thank the Macedonian Society and Vicky for inviting me. And I must say it is very difficult to speak after two very successful economists and very polished speakers. And thank you for what I learned from you tonight. I'd like to focus on the subtitle of tonight's event, which is How to Adapt to Living in Constant Crisis. Because having been a journalist for 40 years in Greece, I feel that that's what I've been dealing with all the time, as everyone else in the country. And I never know if this is going to carry on like this, how we're going to keep surviving. But the story so far is interesting, and I'd like to speak about what I've seen, but also some thoughts of the undercurrents of the big story. And I'd like to finish with a bit of fantasy and wishful thinking at the end, which I hope you will indulge me. The subtitle that I mentioned made me think of a visit to my village in Crete at the start of the Greek crisis in 2010. It was August. I went down with my family. We were sitting in the local taverna, and I saw an acquaintance, a friend from the village, who's always been living in the village, and he's involved in building something, breaking down something else, farming a little bit, giving it up, getting inflating his EU subsidies, getting caught, doing all these little things that keep people afloat there. And I said, how are you dealing with the crisis? And he laughed and he said, I was born in crisis. It's nothing. I thought it was very funny. And then a few months later, he left for Australia. So that has been pretty much how the ups and downs and the feeling of we are resilient, but sometimes we can't cope too well. And if we look at the events of the last few years, there's a lot of up and down. In 2010, the great debt crisis broke. We knew it was coming, we just didn't know when it would come. It was so evident, but the balloon stayed afloat, even if it was leaden, and we were all living quite comfortably with that until the crash came. So 2010 took a very long time for us to start recovering, and then in 2020, the pandemic struck when we were on our way out of the crisis. Then we had the high prices because of the ending of the pandemic, the energy crunch, but tourism had recovered and we were getting money coming back into the country and everything was looking good. Then came Putin's war on Ukraine in 2022. We seem to be coping with that because the government was not going to be suckered the way previous ones were and was using a lot of money to keep people happy and to keep the opposition at bay. And that was running along quite successfully until we got the surveillance scandal, which broke in August of 2022, which is like a slow-burning fire under the surface, which appears now and then, but is going to play a significant role in politics for the next few months, I think, which leads to the next crisis, which hasn't appeared yet, which will be a political one after the elections this year in a few months' time, perhaps in very few months' time, which will be wedged under the simple proportional electoral system, which means that no party will be able to form a government on its own after this election. Most likely no parties will be able to form a viable coalition, and we might go to elections again immediately afterwards with another electoral system, which will give a bonus to the winning party, which means that there might be a one-party government, or at least a two-party one after that election. This leads to a lot of insecurity about where politics will be. We don't know how long this will last, and we don't know what will be happening in the rest of the world while we are tearing away at our navels. Almost as a backdrop to all these crises that I've mentioned, we have ongoing tension with Turkey all the time, which has been pretty constant in the past few years. But more strikingly were the incidents of early 2020 with the rush on the border of thousands of migrants at Ankara's urging. And a little before that, we had a memorandum signed between Turkey and Libya, which defines their two exclusive economic zones, causing very serious problems for Greece because they ignore the presence of Crete, which creates a situation which needs a reply, and that reply creates tensions all the time. There was the navies shadowing each other in the Eastern Med at that time. in 2021. So there's been all of this tension going on, and we've had to deal with that and hope that we can come out of the crisis intact at some point and maybe get over all of these things that we're talking about. None of them is over yet. But things are not as bad as they could have been because somehow we hung on. Greece has shown great resilience. The Greeks have shown great resilience. So regarding the economic crisis of 2010, what went well? Well, the one thing that went well was that we were members of the European Union, and we remained members of the European Union. And that played a huge role, not only in the support, but also in the framework that existed for the Greeks to know what to do, what not to do, and what must not be done at any cost, which was to leave. So that kept minds focused when they could have been wandering in various directions. The other was that Greek society and the economy turned out to have great reserves. There was a lot of money in banks and there was a lot of money under mattresses. And the banks were saved. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about whether that should have been the priority, but I don't think that we would have got anywhere if they had not been saved. Pensions were cut, but they too were saved. And they were paid, and they came to support whole families. At one point, if I remember correctly, about 1 in 2 families was relying on a pension, which also, I think, shows that the statistics might be a little bit suspect. But that also points to the great demographic problem that we are having, and we will have more intensively as time goes on. There are very few people being born, many more are dying. People are not immigrating into Greece. Many are leaving, as you know, especially people at a productive age. So this is not appearing now as a problem, and is also showing a lower than I would expect unemployment rate. But it's a bomb in the foundations for the future. Another positive was the foreign assistance, which was huge amounts of money and also demands for reforms, which is a mixed bag again, and there were many pros and cons to that. But it did help keep things afloat, even though it did create tensions which then caused the problems to become, if not greater, with a longer life. The less tangible things that worked in favor of Greece and the Greeks during the crisis was an instinct for survival and a strong sense of solidarity that existed in society. And we saw this, even though it wasn't big in the news all the time, but the church, which is much maligned usually for a number of reasons, municipalities, other organizations, NGOs, set up soup kitchens, food banks. A lot of people did a lot of work to keep things from getting worse. Then another one of these intangibles is that there is a memory of crisis and problem solving in Greece. Greece has always been in trouble and has always been fighting with one hand behind its back, not only because of its tendency for division all the time, which we will talk about again, but also because it came out of a very vicious war of independence with a lot of poverty, and it's always been in debt, poor, and dependent, and had to fight with that. So we've had, from the beginning, the divisions that come from poverty and lack of resources and a hunger for gains at our neighbor's cost. But we had a disastrous war against Turkey in 1897, which led to foreign intervention and monetary supervision. We had the 1922-23 Asia Minor catastrophe, and then the flood of 1.2 million completely impoverished refugees into the country, which was 25% of the population. Again, starting with a lot of, let's say, a very uphill battle. Then there was the war and occupation and the civil war, which created so much hardship and poverty again, and again a need for foreign intervention and foreign money and foreign supervision. And that has led to a kind of understanding and an ability to absorb shocks, to be angry, to be upset, to be dependent, but also to absorb, because there is a sense of perspective. We know that whatever we lived through in 2010 onwards was nothing compared to what grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandparents in general had lived through in the past. So there was a sense of this is not the worst, but we will keep fighting on. Now, about the economic crisis, what went wrong? Well, in my mind, the biggest problem with the crisis is that it went on for too long. And that was partly the reason, partly the blame of powers outside of Greece, but also the powers inside Greece. And they kind of work to reinforce each other. Because if you remember back to that time, and I don't think you need to, it took a very long time for people to start dealing with the problem when it became apparent. The EU had no machinery in place, no idea how to deal with this, and that was a huge problem for everybody. Germany was unwilling to see that this might be a structural problem in the EU, and the public debate in Germany turned to the wasteful Greeks and the prudent Germans who had to protect themselves. The Greeks, who in the beginning were shocked by what happened and took ownership of the crisis. I remember very clearly there was consensus that we really screwed up. Now we've got to see what we're going to do. We must get serious now. As things dragged on, the stereotypes began to come into place. The foreign comments in magazines, newspapers, and politicians' mouths were very aggressive. So there was a response which was based very much on the foundations that we had in the past of foreign intervention and foreign, what can I call it, indifference to the particular problems of Greece. And then the problems inside Greece were, as the crisis dragged on and there was no clear solution and political parties began to question the wisdom of one policy or another, we got into the usual template of arguing with each other, having conflicting narratives, blaming the different causes for the problem, and not anyone actually being able to agree on what it was and what needed to be done. So in this in the situation, we didn't really pay as much attention as we could have to the real problems of the reform efforts and the stability program, which was not as nuanced and as focused as it should have been to Greece's particular problems. There were a lot of horizontal cuts and a lot of brutal tactics that were used, which reinforced the arguments of the conspiracy theorists and the naysayers and those who were anti-authority and the anti-Western camp, that we might say, which has always existed in Greece. So they came out pretty strong out of that. And I'll get to this. When we got to the pandemic, they again came out strong because of their having gained some credibility through their resistance to the measures to end the economic crisis. So we find ourselves with division as parties try to exploit the situation, and especially whoever is in opposition to make the most of the government's discomfort. And this does not apply to one party. Every party does this, has done it so far. I'd like to see the exception when it comes. The exceptions that have existed have disappeared very quickly, I must add, sadly. So we come to every crisis divided, and this delays the success, delays the end of the crisis, and it leaves a legacy of new wounds always that the next crisis will build on. And also, whenever we do succeed, our success is qualified because it could have been much better if we had better policies from outside and from the way we handle the issues ourselves. And at the bottom of this, my personal understanding is that there is a lack of trust. It's the lack of trust between us that causes this endless undermining of our own efforts. And we can see this very clearly in how the pandemic crisis played out later. You might remember that in the beginning, Greece was the poster boy for dealing with the crisis. Everybody was taken aback by the discipline and the consensus and the effectiventhis and efficiency of Greek officials and the Greek public. It was astonishing to see this. This was partly luck and partly policy. The lucky part was that Greece was not struck by the pandemic very strongly in the beginning. So when the measures came into play, they were very effective because the virus wasn't spreading already in the population as it was elsewhere. And that gave credibility to the people who were coming onto the TV screen in every household every afternoon and speaking very seriously and very determinedly and in unison about what needed to be done. And that created almost a sense of relief that now we were all on the same page. It was a very strong feeling. I hadn't felt that sense of community in Greece, at least while in the time that I've been working. But then again, the problem was that this went on for too long. The damn virus would just not go away, so the crisis continued, and that gave us time to start undermining our efforts again. Because the effort just could not be kept up for much longer. Why? Because there was an impatience. People do get impatient. We know that. It gets to be too much. And that allows the messages that undermine this policy to start coming out and to start gaining traction. And then we get back into our normal behavior, which is having demonstrations, irrelevant to this, but having mass demonstrations when we should have been isolating ourselves and taking care. We got certain sectors of the church showing indifference and spirit of rebellion, in effect, not just disagreeing, but placing church against state in the sense of insisting on communion and not wearing masks, whatever the heads of the church were saying. So the conspiracy theorists who were always present, they got a new lease on life on this. And there was also the fatigue of those who were entrusted with fighting the pandemic, because they had this swelling opposition coming up, an endless pandemic, and the real problems that do exist in Greece, such as the exhaustion of the National Health Service, which had been bearing the brunt of the economic crisis as well. And the people working there had seen their salaries cut horizontally without any regard of whether they worked or not, or whether their colleagues worked or not. So there was an exhausted healthcare system which started yielding. And in the end, after having been the example of how to deal with the crisis, we have a very high death toll. And despite having reached pretty high numbers of vaccinations, because we had an excellent vaccination program. But it's something that is very sad to see after having put in such a great effort to see such loss of life, which is not even mentioned anymore. Why do we have this lack of trust? I think there are many causes for it, but the underlying reason, I'm sure, is a sense that our freedom is not complete, that it's always threatened, and that our society is not equal, doesn't have equality, that there is no justice in it. And when people feel that there's no justice, we all understand, they feel that they don't have the luxury to let their guard down and trust. And I think this is a deeply personal thing for most of us, because Greece's turbulent history affects every lifetime. There hasn't been a generation that hasn't been shaken by some major event. So almost every political awakening of the individual comes in the midst of instability and anger, and a search for someone to blame for what has been happening. And I think this is why there is so much anger in public debate, why it's the norm, and at the same time so much apathy in private, because beside all the noise, we feel that nothing can be done. Nothing can change for the better, only for the worse. And at the same time, we oppose reforms with great passion. I believe that it's because we do not trust them, nor those who advocate them. Because we feel that any change will be to our detriment, it will be to our expense, because we've seen that happen so many times before. And if not to ourselves, to people who tell us about their own experiences. So how do we deal with this great handicap? From the very beginning of the Greek state, from before its establishment even, we've had to fight with poverty, debt, and division, as I said earlier. We're always aware of our need to change our politics, but each generation shows itself unable to do so. Enormous political energy is wasted on meaningless quarrels while major issues go unchallenged, and our politics is based basically on attacking each other. Either because the other side is cruel and inhuman, or because the other one is too wasteful and irresponsible. We see repeatedly, we've seen bright starts disintegrate into cynicism and disillusion. And we know that our politics need reform, but we are unable to achieve it. To undercut this web of interests and expediency that holds everything back. So if we can't expect much from politics on their own, which is the invention of our ancient forefathers, this is, I think, where the power of the press can be revolutionary. And this is where I get into the realm of fantasy. Because right now the news media are part of the problem in politics the world over. We know that. We need not go into examples of how they amplify the foul and they cannot defend or even identify the worthy. If we look back at the first great experiment in democracy, we see that the emphasis of the ancient Athenians was on teaching the citizens themselves civic virtues, and their chief values were freedom and equality and impartial law, citizens' participation and deliberation in things that affected their lives, the teaching of autonomy, social responsibility, a combination of individuality and patriotism. They understood that capable citizens made a capable state, one that would strengthen them all. I think this is something that the news media can work on in every country. Today, the news media, which plays such a great part in the fragmentation that we all see around us through the internet and through what it does itself, has to find a way to build trust. And it can only do this by working to establish its own credibility and to promote fairness and to express a kind of moral core of society. We know what our societies stand for. We need to say that. But how can this be achieved? It's easy to ask for it, but it's very difficult to get to it. There's a very interesting opinion piece written in the last few days. It was published by the Washington Post on January the 30th by Len Downey, the former editor of the Washington Post, and one of the high priests of the Anglo-Saxon need for objectivity in media. And even he has come to the point of saying that we need to fight for the truth, and that means taking a stand in our positions. And this was hailed by people, serious people in the media in America, as an earthquake coming from someone like him. But it's an earthquake that has followed the rupture that the earthquake caused a long time ago, because we can see the damage that has been there. So I'd like to finish off saying that I'd like to see efforts made to reform the press, and then we could see politics change. And I think that that is a way for us to survive crisis, both in Greece and elsewhere. Thank you.
Μόλις έχει τελειώσει λοιπόν αυτή η θαυμάσια εκδήλωση με σειρά ομιλητών και έχουμε την ευκαιρία να μιλήσουμε με την κυρία Στασοπούλου Αναστασία, η οποία είστε...
Εγώ είμαι αντιπρόεδρος του Σύλλογου Μακεδόνου, στο Macedonian Society of Great Britain, είμαι η Vice President. Είμαι στο Σύλλογο πάρα πολλά χρόνια και επειδή ο πρόεδρος μας σήμερα λείπει, τον αντικαθιστώ και έκανα την παρουσίαση των participants και του θέματος και των μελλοντικών events που έχουμε οργανώσει επιτέλους μετά από την πανδημία.
Ναι. Πολύ ενδιαφέρον το θέμα. Δώστε μας περισσότερες λεπτομέρειες για τους ομιλητές.
Η Vicky Pryce είναι μια πάρα πολύ γνωστή οικονομολόγος. Μας έχει βοηθήσει πάρα πολύ και πάντα συμμετέχει στις εκδηλώσεις μας. Έχει γράψει και πάρα πολλά βιβλία σχετικά με αυτό το θέμα και ήταν σήμερα, όπως είδατε, η chairman. Ο Harwood είναι επίσης οικονομολόγος και αναλυτής και ο Νίκος Κωνσταντάρος, ο οποίος είναι γνωστός δημοσιογράφος και αρθρογράφος στην Καθημερινή. Μάλιστα. Αυτοί ήταν οι τρεις participants, ανέλυσαν το θέμα όσο καλύτερα μπορούσαν από την πανδημία μέχρι τον πόλεμο της Ουκρανίας, δηλαδή όλο αυτό και πώς μπορούμε να επιβιώσουμε και να επιζήσουμε και να προσαρμοστούμε στις συνθήκες αυτές που μας ακολουθούν από το 2020 μέχρι σήμερα, οι ατελείωτες κρίσεις, και πώς μπορούμε να προσαρμοστούμε και να ζήσουμε μαθαίνοντας μέσα από αυτές τις κρίσεις.
Οι καλεσμένοι σας ήταν προσωπικές προσκλήσεις ή ήταν ανοιχτή η εκδήλωση για οποιοδήποτε?
Οι καλεσμένοι εννοείται ο κόσμος. Ήταν ανοιχτή πρόσκληση. Πάντα όταν οργανώνουμε μια εκδήλωση, βάζουμε την εκδήλωση στο website. Στέλνουμε προσωπικά email σε όλους όσους είναι members ή φίλοι του Macedonian Society of Great Britain και γενικά έχουμε πολύ μεγάλη ανταπόκριση. Σήμερα είχαμε και live streaming, οπότε και πάρα πολλοί οι οποίοι δεν προλάβαιναν να έρθουν λόγω της ώρας το παρακολούθησαν live streaming. Οπότε έχουμε αρκετά μεγάλη ανταπόκριση, γιατί τα θέματά μας, πιστεύω, και προσωπική μου άποψη είναι αυτή, ότι έχουν πραγματικά πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον και αφορούν στη σημερινή εποχή, στη σύγχρονη εποχή.
Ναι, είναι γεγονός αυτό. Από πόσα μέλη αποτελείται ο σύνδεσμος?
Ο σύλλογος αποτελείται περίπου από 170-180 μέλη. Βέβαια, πάρα πολλοί δυστυχώς έχουν επιστρέψει στην Ελλάδα. Προσπαθούμε να φέρουμε νέους ανθρώπους στο σύλλογο, γιατί όπως και εσείς το ξέρετε πάρα πολύ καλά, έχουν έρθει πάρα πολλοί νέοι τα τελευταία χρόνια. Το Brexit δεν είναι τόσο ανασταλτικός παράγοντας. Μένουν εδώ, ξέρω και από προσωπική μου πείρα, από τα παιδιά μας, από τους συγγενείς μας κλπ. Και ευτυχώς υπάρχουν νέοι και προσπαθούμε γι' αυτό και προσπαθούμε να κάνουμε εκδηλώσεις οι οποίες πραγματικά να κεντρήσουν το ενδιαφέρον των νέων, ώστε να μπορέσουν να έρθουν και στο σύλλογό μας και να γίνουν και members και να παρακολουθούν τις εκδηλώσεις μας, οι οποίες είναι πολλές και περισσότερες. Όσο γίνεται τώρα, φυσικά θα γίνουν πολύ περισσότερες που έχουμε αυτή τη δυνατότητα. Έχουν περάσει κρίσεις, κυρίως του COVID.
Είναι πολλά οι προερχόμενοι από την περιοχή σας εκεί που ζουν εδώ?
Είναι πάρα πολλοί. Και εμείς τους ανακαλύπτουμε σιγά σιγά. Δεν ξέρω, γιατί συνήθως όποιον και να ρωτήσουμε μας λένε είμαστε από την Αθήνα, κλασικά. Οπότε όταν ανακαλύπτουμε ανθρώπους από τη Βόρεια Ελλάδα και δύο από τη Μακεδονία, πραγματικά νιώθουμε καλά, γιατί δεν τρέπονται να πούν την καταγωγή τους. Είναι πολύ σημαντικό. Δεν ντρέπονται για το background τους, ίσα-ίσα που είμαστε όλοι πολύ περήφανοι. Και αυτό μας κάνει και εμάς να χαιρόμαστε, γιατί βλέπουμε πραγματικά ότι υπάρχουν πολλοί άνθρωποι από τη Βόρεια Ελλάδα, όχι μόνο από τη Θεσσαλονίκη. Έχω συναντήσει τον τελευταίο χρόνο, ειδικά, δηλαδή μετά που βγήκαμε από την πανδημία, ανθρώπους από την Κεντρική Μακεδονία, από την Καστοριά, από την Καβάλα και Αυτό είναι πραγματικά εντυπωσιακό και πιστεύω ότι σιγά σιγά και αυτοί θα μάθουν για το σύλλογό μας και θα γίνουν ενεργά μέλη.
Μάλιστα. Πέστε μας λίγο για τις μελλοντικές εκδηλώσεις, τις οποίες αναφέρατε ήδη, αλλά πέστε μας.
Οι δύο μελλοντικές εκδηλώσεις που έχουμε οργανώσει για το 2023 είναι μέσα στο Μάιο ή Ιούνιο, εξαρτάται από τους ανθρώπους οι οποίοι θα συμμετέχουν, πότε θα έχουν ελεύθερο χρόνο, γι' αυτό και δεν μπορούμε ακόμη να πούμε συγκεκριμένη ημερομηνία, και θα είναι μία ανάλυση και ένας τρόπος για να μάθει ο κόσμος τα μετέωρα, που είναι μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα, είναι φυσικά και αναγνωρισμένη από την UNESCO, είναι μνημείο πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς, είναι μοναδικό σε όλο τον κόσμο για τα μοναστήρια των μετεώρων. Θα είναι μια πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα ομιλία. Και η δεύτερη, η οποία θα γίνει από την ιστορικό Bethany Hughes, η οποία ακόμη δεν έχει βρει το θέμα. Είμαστε σε συνεργασία και συνεννόηση μαζί της και θα γίνει γύρω στο Νοέμβριο. Οπότε θα επιλέξει αυτή το θέμα και θα ενημερωθούν φυσικά όλοι σχετικά νωρίς.
Οι εκδηλώσεις σας ως επιτοπλίστων γίνονται σε αυτό το χώρο του Ελληνικού Κέντρου, έτσι?
Ναι, ισχύει αυτό. Έχουμε πολύ καλή συνεργασία με το Ελληνικό Κέντρο. Μας υποστηρίζει και ποτέ δεν έχουμε παράπονο. Πραγματικά είμαστε πάρα πολύ ευχαριστημένοι από όλα αυτά τα χρόνια και από τη συνεργασία που είχαμε όλα αυτά τα χρόνια και που έχουμε και συνεχίζουμε να έχουμε με το Hellenic Centre. Και με την καινούργια φυσικά τη διευθύντρια, με την οποία επίσης έχουμε κάνει μια πάρα πολύ καλή γνωριμία, μια πάρα πολύ καλή συνεργασία και ευελπιστούμε ότι θα συνεχιστεί και στο μέλλον.
Σας ευχαριστούμε, μας μιλήσατε και ευχόμαστε κάθε επιτυχία.
Να είστε καλά, σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Καλή συνέχεια και σε εσάς.